The cold bit at Theresa Vance's cheeks as she hurried along the wooden boardwalk, clutching her worn shawl tightly around her shoulders. Durango, Colorado in 1882 was unforgiving in late autumn, especially when the sun began its early descent behind the jagged San Juan Mountains. She had stayed too long at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for tomorrow's class, and now faced the long walk home in the gathering dusk with storm clouds threatening overhead. The first powerful gust caught her by surprise, whipping around the corner of the Mercantile and nearly knocking her sideways. Theresa steadied herself against a hitching post, watching with dismay as her mother's hand knitted shawl tore from her grasp and danced away like a tumbleweed, carried by the merciless wind toward the edge of town. No. She cried out, lunging forward in a futile attempt to catch it before it disappeared forever. The shawl was one of the few keepsakes she had from her mother, who had passed 2 winters ago. The loss of it would be unbearable. As she stumbled forward, nearly losing her footing on the rough ground, a tall figure on horseback appeared from the direction of the livery. Without hesitation, the rider spurred his mount forward, leaning dangerously from the saddle to snatch the shawl from midair just before it would have been lost in the scrubby terrain beyond the town's edge. Theresa stood shivering, arms wrapped around herself as the horseman approached. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. He wore the practical garb of a working cowboy, sturdy denims, worn boots with well-used spurs, and a heavy canvas duster that had seen many miles of hard country. Without dismounting, he held out her recovered shawl. "Madam," he said simply, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "Thank you," Theresa replied, reaching up for the cherished item. As she did so, another fierce gust tore through the street, this one stronger than the last. The shawl slipped from both their grasps and in an instant was carried high above the buildings, disappearing into the darkening sky. Theresa couldn't help the small cry of distress that escaped her lips. The wind was bitterly cold now, cutting through her thin dress like knives. Without a word, the cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of the garment, still holding his body heat, enveloped her immediately. "I can't take your coat," she protested, though her freezing body betrayed her as she instinctively pulled it tighter. "I've weathered worse," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were a startling blue, clear as mountain lakes against his weather-beaten face. "Where are you headed? I'll see you there safely." "I'm just past the creek, the small house with the blue door," Theresa said, suddenly aware of how alone they were on the rapidly emptying street as townsfolk hurried inside ahead of the approaching storm. "Blake Foster," he introduced himself, taking up the reins of his horse. "I'll walk you." "Theresa Vance," she replied, noticing how he positioned himself between her and the worst of the wind as they began walking. "I'm the schoolteacher." "I know," Blake said simply. When she looked at him questioningly, he added, "Been in town 3 days." People talk about the schoolteacher who came from Boston last year. The journey to her modest house took only 15 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the sky had opened up with a mixture of rain and sleet. Blake insisted on seeing her to her door, his own shirt becoming soaked in the process. "Please, come in and dry yourself by the fire," Theresa offered, feeling responsible for his discomfort. "It's the least I can do after you've been so kind." Blake hesitated, glancing back at his horse tied to her fence post. "Wouldn't be proper," he said finally. "It wouldn't be proper to let you catch pneumonia either," Theresa countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "Your horse will be fine under that big oak for a few minutes while you warm up." Something like amusement flickered across his face before he nodded. "Just until the worst passes," he agreed. Inside her small but tidy home, Theresa quickly built up the fire while Blake stood awkwardly by the door, careful not to drip on her clean floors. "I have some coffee I can put on," she offered, acutely aware that she was alone with a man she had just met. In Boston, such a situation would be scandalous, but the West operated under different rules of necessity. That would be welcome, Blake replied, finally removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. As Theresa busied herself with the coffee pot, she stole glances at her unexpected guest. There was something in his manner, a quiet dignity mixed with wariness that spoke of a man who had seen his share of hardship. "What brings you to Durango, Mr. Foster?" she asked, trying to fill the silence that had settled between them. Blake turned from studying the small collection of books on her shelf. "Work," he said simply. "Signed on with the Carver Ranch outside town, breaking horses." "That's dangerous work," Theresa commented, handing him a steaming cup. "It's what I know," he replied with a slight shrug. Their fingers brushed as he took the cup from her, and Theresa felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. For the next half hour, as the storm raged outside, Theresa drew out small pieces of Blake's story. He'd been born in Texas, learned ranching from his father, fought briefly in the closing days of the war though he'd been barely old enough, and had spent the years since moving from job to job across the Western territories. He spoke little of family, and Theresa sensed loss there that matched her own. When the rain finally slackened, Blake set down his empty cup. "I should go, thank you for the coffee." Theresa walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Thank you again for your help and for the loan of your coat." Blake looked down at his duster still wrapped around her shoulders. "Keep it until tomorrow, I can collect it when the weather's better." "Oh, I couldn't, please," he said, and something in his eyes stopped her protest. "It would ease my mind to know you're warm." Before she could respond, he placed his hat on his head, nodded once, and stepped out into the damp evening. Theresa watched from her doorway as he mounted his horse and rode away, his straight-backed figure gradually disappearing into the misty twilight. She closed the door, drawing his coat tighter around her shoulders, inhaling the scent of leather, horses, and something distinctly masculine. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, the loneliness that had been her constant companion felt somehow less overwhelming. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Theresa arrived at the schoolhouse earlier than usual, Blake's coat folded neatly and placed in her satchel. She had no way of knowing when he might come to retrieve it, and the thought of seeing him again caused an unfamiliar flutter in her stomach that she tried to dismiss. Her students filed in at 8 o'clock sharp, 15 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, the offspring of ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners from the surrounding area. Teaching them was challenging but rewarding, so different from the rigid Boston academy where she had previously taught. She had just finished the morning arithmetic lesson when the schoolhouse door opened. Blake Foster stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Pardon the interruption, madam," he said, his eyes finding hers across the room. The children turned in their seats, curious about the visitor. Whispers rippled through the room. "That's Mr. Foster from the Carver place," young Tommy Wilson informed his seatmate loudly. "Pa says he can break any horse that breathes." "Class," Theresa called, regaining their attention, "please continue with your sums while I speak with Mr. Foster." She walked to the door, conscious of 28 curious eyes following her progress. "Good morning, Mr. Foster," she said formally, stepping outside with him. "I've brought your coat. Thank you for lending it to me." She retrieved the folded duster from her satchel and handed it to him, aware that her cheeks had flushed slightly. "No trouble," Blake replied, taking the coat. He seemed about to say something more, then stopped, his eyes moving to something beyond her shoulder. Theresa turned to see several small faces pressed against the schoolhouse window. "I should let you return to your students," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Yes," Theresa agreed, oddly disappointed. "Thank you again." Blake nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Miss Vance," he said, then hesitated. "There's a social at the church on Saturday evening. Will you be attending?" The question caught her off guard. "I hadn't decided," she answered truthfully. Though she'd been in Durango for over a year, she still felt like an outsider at such gatherings. "Well, if you do," Blake continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I'd be honored if you'd save me a dance." Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat and strode away, leaving Theresa staring after him with a mixture of surprise and something that felt suspiciously like hope. The Saturday social arrived with Theresa still undecided about attending. She had gone to several such gatherings during her time in Durango, but always felt somewhat out of place among the established families with their long histories in the territory. As a single woman from the East, she was subject to well-meaning but persistent matchmaking attempts from the community matrons, which only increased her discomfort. Yet as evening approached, she found herself taking special care with her appearance, pinning her chestnut hair in a more becoming style and choosing her blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. By the time she left her house, the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The church hall was already filled with people when she arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathered townsfolk. A small band of local musicians played cheerful tunes in one corner while children darted between the adults in improvised games. "Miss Vance." "We were hoping you'd join us," called Martha Jenkins, wife of the general store owner. "Come, let me introduce you to my nephew who's visiting from Denver. Such a respectable young man works in a bank." For the next hour, Theresa was drawn into conversation after conversation, all while her eyes kept straying to the door. There was no sign of Blake Foster, and she began to wonder if he had changed his mind. She was just accepting a cup of punch from Martha's eager nephew when the door opened, and Blake entered. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt with a string tie under a well-worn but brushed vest. His usual riding boots had been exchanged for polished town shoes. Despite these concessions to the social occasion, he still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a man more at home on the open range than in a crowded hall. Blake's eyes scanned the room, stopping when they found Theresa. She felt her heart quicken as he made his way through the crowd toward her. "Miss Vance," he said, tipping his head slightly, "you look lovely tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Foster," she replied, aware of the curious glances from those nearby. "I'm glad you could attend." "I believe you promised this gentleman a dance," Martha Jenkins interjected, her eyes bright with interest at this new development. "I believe I did," Theresa agreed, setting down her untouched punch. The musicians had just begun a waltz, and without further conversation, Blake offered his arm. His hand at her waist was firm but respectful as he guided her into the dance. Theresa had expected him to be awkward. Many of the local men were uncomfortable with formal dancing, but Blake moved with surprising grace. "You dance very well, Mr. Foster," she commented as they circled the floor. A small smile touched his lips. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said no boy of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a bear with a sore paw." The image made Theresa laugh. "She sounds like a formidable woman." "She was," he replied, the past tense telling Theresa all she needed to know. They continued in comfortable silence, moving together as if they had danced many times before. When the music ended, Blake didn't immediately release her hand. "Would you care to step outside for a moment?" he asked quietly. "It's getting rather warm in here." Conscious of the watching eyes, Theresa nodded. They made their way to the church steps, where the cool night air was a welcome relief from the crowded hall. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the quiet town. A few other couples had also sought the peace of the outdoors, dotting the churchyard in quiet conversation. "I'm surprised to see you here," Theresa admitted as they stood side by side, looking up at the star-filled sky. "You don't strike me as a man who enjoys these gatherings." Blake's profile was strong in the moonlight. "I don't generally," he conceded. "But sometimes a man finds reasons to do things he wouldn't ordinarily do." The implication hung in the air between them. Theresa felt her pulse quicken but kept her voice steady. "And what might those reasons be, Mr. Foster?" Blake turned to face her then, his blue eyes serious. "I think you know, Miss Vance." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the church door opening and the pastor's wife announcing that refreshments were being served. The moment broken, they returned inside where Theresa was immediately pulled into conversation with several of her students' mothers. For the remainder of the evening, she was aware of Blake's presence even when they were separated by the room. Their eyes would meet across the crowd, and each time something unspoken passed between them. When the social ended and people began to depart, Blake appeared at her side. "May I walk you home, Miss Vance?" "That would be very kind, thank you," she replied, ignoring Martha Jenkins' meaningful look as they left together. The streets of Durango were quiet as they walked, their path lit by moonlight. Blake kept a respectable distance between them, his hands clasped behind his back. "How long do you plan to stay in Durango?" Theresa asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I signed on with Carver until spring," Blake replied. "After that, I haven't decided." "You've never stayed in one place very long, have you?" He shook his head. "Not since the war. Always seemed easier to keep moving." "And what are you looking for as you move from place to place?" Theresa asked softly. Blake was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I'm not sure I was looking for anything. Maybe just running from memories." They had reached her house, the blue door silvered by moonlight. Blake stopped at the gate, maintaining the propriety that the situation demanded. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Vance," he said formally. "Theresa," she corrected him. "I think after sharing a dance and 2 conversations, you might call me Theresa." A smile touched his lips. "Theresa," he repeated as if testing the name. "Then I'm Blake." "Good night, Blake," she said, opening her gate. "Good night, Theresa." He touched the brim of his hat. "Would it be improper if I called on you tomorrow afternoon?" The question surprised and pleased her. "Not at all. I'd welcome the company." With a final nod, Blake turned and walked away. Theresa watched until his figure disappeared into the darkness before entering her house, a smile lingering on her lips long after she had prepared for bed. True to his word, Blake appeared at her door the following afternoon. He had brought his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes. "I thought you might enjoy a ride," he suggested. "There's a place not far from town I'd like to show you if you're willing." Theresa hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Though she had been raised in the city, she had taken to riding since coming west, finding freedom in the vast landscapes that surrounded Durango. "Give me a moment to change," she said, disappearing inside to don her split riding skirt and boots. When she returned, Blake had secured a second horse, a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable. He helped her mount with strong, steady hands, then swung easily into his own saddle. They rode at a leisurely pace, following a trail that led away from town and into the rolling foothills. The day was perfect for riding: clear skies, mild temperature, and just enough breeze to carry the scent of pine and sage across the land. "How did you come to Durango?" Blake asked as they rode side by side. "It's a long way from Boston." Theresa's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "After my parents died, first my father from a heart condition, then my mother from pneumonia the following winter, there was little to keep me in Boston. I had been teaching at a girls' academy, but the life felt," she searched for the right word, "confined." "So you came west?" Blake prompted when she fell silent. "Yes. The territorial school board was advertising for teachers. Durango needed someone willing to come to a mining town that was still establishing itself. It seemed like an adventure, and I needed one. Do you regret it?" Blake asked, his eyes studying her profile. Theresa considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It's been difficult at times and lonelier than I expected, but I don't regret coming. The children need education, and I've found purpose here." She looked over at him. "What about you? Do you regret the path your life has taken?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "I've made mistakes," he said finally. "Things I wish I could change, but regret doesn't serve much purpose out here." They crested a small rise, and Blake drew his horse to a halt. "Here," he said simply. Theresa gasped at the vista before them. The valley spread out below, the Animas River winding through it like a silver ribbon. The San Juan Mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped despite the late autumn season. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the panoramic view. "I found this spot my second day here," Blake said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "Reminded me there are still places worth stopping for." They sat on a sun-warmed boulder, the horses grazing contentedly nearby. For a while, they simply enjoyed the view in companionable silence. "Tell me about your family," Theresa said eventually. "You mentioned your mother taught you to dance." A shadow crossed Blake's face, but he nodded. "My parents had a small ranch in Central Texas. Not much, but enough to raise 5 boys and keep food on the table. I was the middle son." "5 boys," Theresa smiled. "Your poor mother." That brought a genuine laugh from Blake. "She held her own, could outshoot my father and still have dinner on the table by sundown." His expression sobered. "The war changed everything. My 2 oldest brothers joined the Confederate Army in '62, neither came home." "I'm sorry," Theresa said softly. "After that, nothing was the same. My father never recovered from losing them. The ranch fell into disrepair. When he died in '68, my mother sold what was left and moved to live with her sister in San Antonio. My younger brothers went with her, but I headed west. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, whatever paid enough to keep moving." "And your mother and brothers now?" Blake shook his head. "Fever took my mother in '75, my youngest brother with her. The other works for the railroad in California. We write occasionally." Theresa's heart ached for the losses he had endured. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his. "Thank you for sharing that with me." Blake looked down at their joined hands, then turned his palm up to hold hers properly. His skin was calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "What about you?" he asked. "Any siblings?" "Just me," Theresa replied. "My mother had several miscarriages before and after me. My father was a professor of literature at Harvard. Our home was always filled with books and ideas." She smiled at the memory. "He would have been scandalized by my adventure west, but I like to think he would have understood eventually." They talked until the sun began its descent toward the horizon, sharing stories of their pasts and discovering unexpected commonalities despite their different backgrounds. As they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey, Theresa realized she had never felt so comfortable with anyone before. The ride back to town was filled with easy conversation and occasional laughter. When they reached her house, Blake helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Theresa said, looking up at him in the golden light of the setting sun. "It was my pleasure," Blake replied, his voice low. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back respectfully. "Would it be too forward to call on you again?" "Not at all," she answered, surprised by the strength of her disappointment when he didn't move closer. "I would like that very much." Over the next several weeks, Blake became a regular visitor at Theresa's small house. Sometimes he would arrive with fresh game he had hunted or fish from the river. Other times he brought simple wildflowers that he had gathered on his ride to town. They would share meals that Theresa prepared, talk for hours by the fire, or simply read together in comfortable silence. On Sundays, they attended church together, causing a flurry of speculation among the townsfolk. Theresa found she didn't mind the whispers and knowing looks. For the first time since arriving in Durango, she felt truly connected to someone. December arrived with heavy snowfall that transformed the landscape into a glistening white expanse. The children at school grew excited as Christmas approached, and Theresa threw herself into preparations for the holiday performance that had become a tradition in the small community. Blake continued to work at the Carver Ranch, but made the journey into town whenever weather permitted. On one such visit, as they sat before the fire after dinner, he brought up a subject they had both been avoiding. "Spring will be here before we know it," he said, watching the flames dance in the hearth, Theresa's hands stilled in her lap. "Yes, I suppose it will," she replied carefully. I told Carver I'd stay until the spring roundup, Blake continued. After that you'll move on, Theresa finished for him, trying to keep the sadness from her voice. As you always do. Blake turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. That's what I've always done, he agreed. But for the first time, I'm not sure it's what I want to do. Hope fluttered in Theresa's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. What do you want, Blake? He reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. I want to stop running, he said simply. I want to build something that lasts. His eyes held her steadily. With you, if you'll have me. Theresa's breath caught in her throat. Are you proposing, Mr. Foster? A smile touched his lips at her formal address. I believe I am, Miss Vance. Though I know it's sudden, and I don't have much to offer except hard work and devotion. Those are the most valuable things a man can offer, Theresa replied, her voice thick with emotion. Is that a yes? Blake asked, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. In answer, Theresa leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, Blake's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. Yes, she whispered. The Christmas festivities in Durango that year were particularly joyous for Theresa. The school performance was a success, with even the most reluctant students participating enthusiastically. The entire town gathered afterward for a communal dinner and gift exchange. Blake sat beside her throughout the evening, his presence a solid comfort. They had agreed to wait until after Christmas to announce their engagement, wanting to enjoy the private happiness between them for a little while longer. As the new year of 1883 dawned, their plans began to take shape. Blake had saved a modest sum from his years of work, enough to make a down payment on a small parcel of land outside town. It wasn't much 40 acres with a dilapidated cabin that would need significant work, but it offered a foundation for their future. The announcement of their engagement was met with general approval from the community. Though some expressed surprise at the schoolteacher's choice of a wandering cowboy, most had observed the genuine affection between them and offered sincere congratulations. Winter slowly gave way to spring, the snow retreating up the mountainsides as warmer days awakened the dormant landscape. Blake divided his time between his work at the Carver Ranch and renovations on their future home. Theresa continued teaching but spent her weekends helping Blake with the cabin, learning skills she never would have imagined needing in her Boston life. One Saturday in early April, they were working together on the cabin roof when Blake suddenly stopped, looking off toward the horizon. What is it? Theresa asked, following his gaze. Storm coming, he replied, nodding toward the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. We should get you back to town before it hits. They quickly gathered their tools and secured what they had been working on. Blake helped Theresa onto her horse, then mounted his own. They had barely covered half the distance to town when the storm overtook them. The wind came first, fierce gusts that bent the new spring grass and whipped dust into small funnels across the terrain. Then came the rain, cold and driving, reducing visibility to mere yards. This way, Blake shouted over the howling wind. There's a line shack nearby where we can wait it out. Theresa followed him, struggling to control her frightened horse as lightning cracked overhead. The small wooden structure appeared through the curtain of rain, a basic shelter used by cowboys during roundup. They dismounted quickly, Blake leading the horses to the lee side of the building, where a crude lean-to offered some protection. Inside, the shack was sparse but sound, with a small stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bunk. Blake moved efficiently, starting a fire in the stove while Theresa wrung water from her soaked skirts. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rattling the windows and sending gusts of wind down the stovepipe. Are you all right? Blake asked, turning to her once the fire was established. Theresa nodded, though she was shivering. Just cold. Blake crossed to her, removing his wet coat and draping it over a chair. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, sharing his warmth. Better. Much, she murmured, resting her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. They stayed that way for several minutes, the simple comfort of closeness warming them both. When Theresa finally looked up, she found Blake watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face, "that the wind tore your shawl away that day." "I was thinking the same thing," she admitted with a smile, "though I did love that shawl." "I'll get you another," Blake promised, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I don't need another shawl," Theresa said, leaning into his touch. "I have everything I need." This time when their lips met, there was a new urgency, a deeper passion that had been building between them for months. Theresa's arms wound around Blake's neck as his hands pressed against the small of her back, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. The propriety that had governed their courtship seemed suddenly fragile in the face of their desire and the isolation the storm provided. "We should wait," Blake said, though the reluctance in his voice was evident. "It's only 3 more weeks until the wedding." Theresa nodded, stepping back slightly though she kept her hands on his arms. "You're right," she agreed, then smiled mischievously. "Though I'm not sure anyone would be scandalized if they knew, given the circumstances." Blake laughed, the tension broken. "Maybe not, but I aim to do right by you in all ways, Theresa Vance." They passed the hours until the storm abated in conversation, planning their future together. Blake spoke of his hopes for their small ranch, starting with a few head of cattle, and gradually building a breeding program for quality horses. Theresa shared her ideas for continuing to teach while also creating a home. By the time the rain stopped and they could safely return to town, it was nearly dusk. They rode side by side, the freshly washed landscape gleaming in the evening light. "It's going to be a beautiful spring," Theresa observed, taking in the vibrant green that had emerged from the previously brown terrain. "The first of many," Blake replied, reaching across to take her hand. Their wedding took place on the first Saturday in May, a simple ceremony in the town church, followed by a celebration that brought together the entire community. Theresa wore a new dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Denver, while Blake looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit that Mrs. Jenkins had insisted on altering to fit him properly. After the festivities, they rode together to their cabin, now transformed into a cozy if modest home. Blake lifted Theresa from her horse and carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in the main room that served as both kitchen and living area. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Theresa looked around at the space they had created together, the polished wood floors, the curtains she had sewn from fabric brought all the way from Denver, the handcrafted furniture Blake had either made or traded for. It was simple, but it was theirs. "It's perfect," she said, turning back to her husband with shining eyes. "Everything is perfect." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Theresa felt a contentment she had never known before. The path that had brought her west, that had led her to this man and this life, seemed suddenly clear and purposeful. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, his fingers gently tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the wind knows better than we do where we should go," she replied, nestling closer to him. Blake's soft laughter rumbled beneath her ear. "If that's true, I owe the wind my thanks." "As do I," Theresa agreed, lifting her head to kiss him in the darkness. The years that followed were not without challenges. Building a ranch from nearly nothing required backbreaking work and unwavering determination. There were seasons of drought that threatened their livestock, harsh winters that tested their endurance, and the constant struggle of carving a living from the demanding land. Yet, there were joys that balanced the hardships. Their first child, a daughter they named Caroline after Blake's mother, arrived the following spring, bringing new brightness to their lives. A son, David, followed 2 years later, and another daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years after that. Theresa continued to teach, first taking her children with her to the schoolhouse, and later, as the community grew, helping to establish a larger school where she became the principal teacher. Blake's careful breeding program began to pay dividends, with his horses becoming known throughout the region for their intelligence and stamina. By 1890, their original 40 acres had expanded to over 200. The once dilapidated cabin was now a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and even the luxury of indoor plumbing that Blake had insisted on installing despite the considerable expense. On the 8th anniversary of their wedding, Blake surprised Theresa with a gift. As twilight settled over the land, he led her to the front porch where a rocking chair sat with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, smiling at his evident excitement. "Open it and see," he replied, leaning against the porch railing as she sat in the chair and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a shawl, exquisitely knitted in soft wool the color of summer sky. Theresa's eyes filled with tears as she ran her fingers over the intricate pattern. "Blake, it's beautiful," she whispered. "I had Mrs. Rodriguez make it," he explained, referring to an elderly woman in town known for her exceptional needlework. "I described your mother's shawl as best I could remember." Theresa stood, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders. "It's perfect," she said, stepping into his embrace. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" Blake's arms tightened around her. "I ask myself the same question every day." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, watching as their children played in the yard with the family dog. The life they had built together stretched around them, the barn full of horses, the cattle grazing in the distance, the orchard Blake had planted beginning to bear fruit. "Do you ever miss it?" Theresa asked softly. "The freedom of moving from place to place." Blake considered the question seriously before shaking his head. "Not once," he replied. "Everything I was looking for I found right here." As if to punctuate his words, a gust of wind swept across the porch, catching the edges of Theresa's new shawl. But this time, Blake's hand was there to secure it, just as he had secured their life together with care, with purpose, with love. "I'm glad the wind brought me to you," Theresa said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "As am I," Blake agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "As am I." Together they watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light a testament to possibilities that even the vast western frontier could not contain, the enduring possibility of finding home in another's heart.